At her father's funeral, Elena Morrison Bradford placed a single white rose on the casket, while her husband Thomas stood in the parking lot, openly kissing his mistress Sophia and laughing about the divorce he'd served the moment they left the cemetery. What Thomas didn't realize was that the grieving, pregnant wife he treated with such contempt was the secret multi-billionaire who'd anonymously bought his family's failing Bradford Industrial Group 6 months prior, saving them from the bankruptcy his reckless decisions had caused. His plan was calculated and cruel: divorce Elena immediately after her father's burial, marry Sophia within the week, and finally escape what he called the worst mistake of his life. But when Thomas's mother, Catherine, arrived at their home that evening and threw Elena's luggage into the street with venomous rage, screaming that she was cleansing their family of its biggest embarrassment, she had no idea the suitcases she was hurling contained keys to properties worth more than the entire Bradford estate. The arrival of a dozen corporate attorneys and a police escort wasn't coincidental. They came to inform the Bradfords that their company, their homes, and their futures were controlled by Morrison International Holdings, and that the CEO was currently standing in the rain, collecting her scattered belongings from the gutter. How long would Thomas stare at the corporate letterhead before recognizing his wife's maiden name? What would Catherine do when she realized the woman she'd just publicly humiliated owned the roof over her head? And what revenge would a betrayed billionaire exact on the family that chose a mistress over their pregnant wife at her father's funeral? The November rain fell in cold sheets across Riverside Cemetery, each drop seeming to hammer another nail into Elena Morrison Bradford's breaking heart as she stood before her father's mahogany casket. Her right hand rested protectively on her 6-month pregnant belly, while her left hand trembled as she placed a single white rose on the polished wood, whispering a goodbye to the only person who'd ever truly loved her unconditionally. The black dress she wore hung loosely on her frame. She'd lost weight everywhere except her stomach, grief stealing her appetite for weeks while the life inside her grew stronger, unaware of the tragedy surrounding its existence. Behind her, perhaps 50 feet away in the parking lot, her husband Thomas Bradford stood beneath an umbrella with his mistress, Sophia Chen, and Elena could hear their laughter, cutting through the sound of rain and distant thunder. She didn't need to turn around to know what she'd see: Thomas's hand on Sophia's waist, their bodies pressed together without shame or discretion, his lips probably on hers in the same parking lot where Elena's father's hearse had arrived just 2 hours earlier. The funeral director had pulled her aside 20 minutes ago, his face flushed with embarrassment, asking if she wanted him to address the situation with her husband. But Elena had simply shaken her head, too exhausted and heartbroken to care anymore about Thomas's public humiliation of her. What Thomas didn't know, what nobody in his entire self-important Bradford family knew, was that the grieving woman they'd all dismissed as a fortunate nobody who'd trapped their golden boy was the anonymous owner of Morrison International Holdings, the mysterious multi-billionaire empire her father had helped her build from a small inheritance into a $17 billion conglomerate. The modest accountant persona she'd maintained throughout their 3-year marriage hadn't been deception, but rather a test. One Thomas had failed so spectacularly that Elena sometimes wondered if she'd married a complete stranger who'd been wearing a mask during their courtship. Her father had warned her, of course, had questioned Thomas's intentions when he'd proposed after just 6 months of dating, but Elena had been blinded by what she'd believed was genuine love, convinced that Thomas saw her for who she truly was rather than what she could provide. 6 months ago, when Thomas's reckless business decisions had brought Bradford Industrial Group to the edge of bankruptcy, acquisitions made with borrowed money, contracts signed without proper legal review, partnerships with companies that existed only on paper, Elena had used Morrison International to anonymously purchase the failing company for $800 million, preventing the collapse that would have destroyed 4 generations of Bradford legacy. She'd restructured their debt, renegotiated their contracts, and saved 3,000 jobs, all while Thomas complained over dinner about the corporate vultures who'd stolen his family's company, never once suspecting that the vulture wearing an apron and serving him pot roast was actually his wife, the woman he now openly despised. The sound of dress shoes on wet pavement made Elena turn slightly, and her stomach dropped as she saw Thomas approaching, his expression cold and businesslike, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a manila envelope that she recognized immediately. She'd seen enough legal documents in her corporate life to know divorce papers when she saw them, but the timing, the sheer cruelty of serving them here, now at her father's graveside, took her breath away in a way that even his affair with Sophia hadn't managed to accomplish. Thomas stopped 3 feet away from her, not quite meeting her eyes, his jaw set in that stubborn way she'd once found attractive but now recognized as simple weakness masquerading as determination. "I think we both know this has been over for a long time," Thomas said, his voice carrying no emotion, no acknowledgement of where they stood or what day this was, or the fact that Elena's father, the man who'd walked her down the aisle to marry Thomas, was lying in a casket between them. "My attorney says it's better to start the process immediately rather than dragging it out. Sign these tonight and we can both move forward with our lives." Elena took the envelope with numb fingers, her mind unable to fully process that this was actually happening, that the man she'd married was actually serving her divorce papers at her father's funeral while his mistress waited in the parking lot like some kind of victory prize. She didn't open the envelope, didn't look at the papers inside, just held it against her chest like a shield that had arrived far too late to protect anything that mattered. Thomas waited perhaps 5 seconds for a response that Elena couldn't summon, then turned and walked back toward the parking lot, back toward Sophia, back toward whatever life he'd imagined for himself that didn't include a pregnant wife or the obligations that came with vows he'd apparently never meant. The funeral director approached again, his eyes full of pity that made Elena's skin crawl, but before he could speak, her phone buzzed with a text from her head of security. "Mrs. Bradford, your mother-in-law Catherine just arrived at your residence with 3 additional vehicles, awaiting your instructions." Elena closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything. Catherine Bradford had been planning this moment for 3 years, ever since her son Thomas had announced his engagement to Elena Morrison, a woman with no social connections, no prestigious family name, and no apparent value beyond a pretty face that had somehow bewitched her brilliant son into making the worst decision of his life. The moment Thomas had called her from the cemetery, his voice tight with relief as he confirmed he'd served the divorce papers, Catherine had gathered her sister Margaret and 2 family friends, loaded Thomas's belongings into her Range Rover, and driven to the Bradford estate, the home that would soon be cleansed of the parasite who'd contaminated their family for far too long. The rain had intensified by the time Catherine's vehicle pulled into the circular driveway, the sprawling colonial mansion looking gray and imposing against the darkening November sky. But Catherine felt nothing except righteous satisfaction as she stepped out of her car, her Hermes boots splashing through puddles without care. Margaret emerged from the passenger side, her expression uncertain in a way that irritated Catherine. Her sister had always been too soft, too concerned with propriety and feelings, never understanding that some situations required a firm hand and absolute resolve. The 2 friends, Patricia Aldridge and Veronica Hunt, followed with the enthusiasm of women who'd been promised front-row seats to a social execution they could discuss at their next country club luncheon. "The security code is still the same?" Margaret asked, her voice nearly lost in the sound of rain hammering against expensive cars and manicured landscaping that would soon belong to Thomas alone, once this unfortunate chapter of his life was finally closed. "Thomas gave it to me months ago," Catherine replied, punching in the 8-digit code with fingers that shook slightly, not from nervousness but from anger that had been building for 3 years. Anger at Elena for trapping her son with a pregnancy that Catherine privately suspected had been calculated from the beginning. The heavy front door swung open, revealing the marble foyer that Catherine had helped Thomas select when he'd bought this property 5 years ago, back when Bradford Industrial Group was still thriving and her son's future had looked unlimited rather than constrained by bad decisions and worse marriages. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and Catherine moved through the space with the confidence of someone who believed she had every right to be there, her eyes scanning for any sign of Elena but finding none. The master bedroom was upstairs, and Catherine climbed the curved staircase, with Margaret trailing behind, still making worried sounds about whether they should wait for Thomas or perhaps reconsider this approach, suggestions that Catherine ignored completely because she'd learned long ago that hesitation was the enemy of necessary action. Elena's belongings were exactly where Catherine expected them to be, in the walk-in closet that took up half of the master suite, clothes hanging neatly on wooden hangers, shoes arranged by color and style, everything organized in that precise way that had always seemed pretentious to Catherine, as if someone from Elena's background had any right to such carefully curated elegance. Catherine grabbed an armful of dresses, silk, and cashmere that had probably cost Thomas a fortune, and carried them downstairs without bothering to be gentle, her friends following with suitcases and boxes that they'd dragged from the closet with increasing enthusiasm. The front door was still open when Catherine reached it, rain blowing into the foyer and darkening the expensive marble. But Catherine didn't care about water damage or ruined finishes as she hurled Elena's belongings into the driveway, watching dresses land in puddles and shoes scatter across wet pavement. Margaret made a sound of protest, something about this being too far, but Catherine silenced her with a look that had cowed her younger sister for 5 decades, then went back inside for another load, for the jewelry boxes and photo albums and all the other detritus of a marriage that should never have existed in the first place. It took 6 trips to empty Elena's closet completely, and by the time Catherine finished, the driveway looked like a yard sale in a hurricane. Expensive belongings scattered and ruined, designer labels visible on clothes that were now soaked and probably unwearable. Patricia and Veronica stood on the front porch, their phones out and recording, delighted by the drama they'd participated in, already composing the texts they'd send to their social circles about Catherine Bradford's righteous fury and Elena Morrison's well-deserved humiliation. Catherine stood in the rain, breathing hard from exertion and satisfaction, her hands on her hips as she surveyed her handiwork with pride. She didn't hear the vehicles approaching until they were already in the driveway. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows and corporate plates, followed by 2 police cruisers with lights flashing but no sirens. Catherine's first thought was that someone had called the police on her, that some neighbor had misunderstood the situation, but her confidence didn't waver. She had every right to remove her son's soon-to-be ex-wife's belongings, and no small-town cop was going to intimidate her with their presence. But when the SUV doors opened and 12 people emerged, men and women in expensive dark suits carrying leather briefcases and tablets, their expressions professional and completely impassive, Catherine's certainty flickered for the first time. These weren't police officers or concerned neighbors or even attorneys coming to mediate some domestic dispute. These were corporate executioners, and they were looking at Catherine the way sharks might look at something bleeding in the water. The lead attorney, a silver-haired woman in her 50s carrying a folder stamped with a logo Catherine didn't recognize, approached with measured steps, her shoes clicking against wet pavement as she navigated around the scattered clothes and ruined belongings that Catherine had so recently thrown there. She stopped perhaps 5 feet away, her eyes moving from Catherine to Margaret to the two friends still filming on their phones, her expression never changing from that neutral mask of professional detachment that somehow felt more threatening than any display of anger could have been. "Mrs. Catherine Bradford?" the woman asked, her voice carrying clearly despite the rain. And when Catherine nodded, the woman opened her folder and withdrew a document that she held out with one hand. "My name is Victoria Chen, senior partner at Morrison International Holdings. I'm here to inform you that as of 6 months ago, Morrison International became the primary shareholder and operational controller of Bradford Industrial Group, which means that every asset currently held under the Bradford family name, including this residence, is subject to immediate review and potential seizure based on contractual violations outlined in Section 12 of the acquisition agreement." Catherine took the document with hands that had started trembling for entirely different reasons than anger, her eyes scanning legal language that she couldn't quite process, words like foreclosure and breach of contract and immediate termination swimming in front of her vision. Margaret moved closer, reading over her shoulder, her face going pale as she reached the signature at the bottom of the page, a signature that read, "Elena Christine Morrison, CEO and founder, Morrison International Holdings." "There must be some mistake," Catherine heard herself saying, but her voice sounded distant and uncertain, nothing like the confident tone she'd been using just moments before. "Elena Morrison is my son's wife. She's a nobody. She's standing right behind you," Victoria Chen interrupted, and Catherine turned to see a taxi pulling into the driveway, its door opening to reveal Elena, still wearing her black funeral dress, still visibly pregnant, her face streaked with rain and tears, as she climbed out and stood there, looking at her scattered belongings with an expression that Catherine couldn't quite read. Elena stood in the rain, her pregnant body swaying slightly as she looked at the wreckage of her belongings scattered across the driveway like trash thrown from a moving vehicle, and for a moment she felt nothing except a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching this scene happen to someone else entirely. The black funeral dress clung to her skin, heavy with water, and her shoes, simple flats she'd chosen for comfort rather than style, squelched in the puddles as she moved slowly toward the pile of ruined clothes and broken picture frames, her hands moving automatically to pick up a photo album that had landed face down in a puddle, its pages already warping from water damage. Catherine Bradford stood frozen on the front porch, her face cycling through expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances, confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief morphing into horror, horror settling finally into a kind of pale terror that made her look suddenly older than her 63 years. Margaret had backed away from her sister, creating physical distance as if Catherine's situation might be contagious, while Patricia and Veronica had lowered their phones with the dawning realization that they'd just filmed themselves participating in the destruction of a multi-billionaire's property, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by the sick understanding that they'd made a catastrophic mistake. "Mrs. Morrison Bradford," Victoria Chen said, her voice gentler now as she approached Elena with an umbrella that she held over both their heads, creating a small dry space in the downpour. "The team has documented everything. We have 17 witnesses, multiple video recordings, and sufficient cause to proceed with immediate legal action against all parties involved in the destruction of your personal property." Elena looked up from the photo album, pictures from her wedding day, images of her father walking her down the aisle, moments that had felt sacred just 3 years ago, but now seemed like evidence of the worst judgment she'd ever exercised. She met Victoria's eyes and saw concern there, mixed with professional anger on her behalf, but Elena felt too empty to match that anger, too exhausted from grief and betrayal to summon anything except a bone-deep weariness that made even standing upright feel like an impossible task. Her hand moved to her belly, feeling the baby kick as if responding to her emotional turmoil, and that small movement, that reminder of innocent life depending on her, was what finally broke through the numbness. "Tell me what I own," Elena said quietly, and Victoria's expression shifted into something that might have been satisfaction. "You own Bradford Industrial Group completely. 100% of shares as of the final acquisition 6 months ago," Victoria began, pulling out her tablet and scrolling through documents, even as rain continued to fall around them. "You own this residence and 4 other properties currently occupied by Bradford family members, including Catherine Bradford's penthouse in Manhattan and Thomas Bradford's lake house in Connecticut. You control their investment portfolios, their trust funds, and their operating accounts. Thomas Bradford currently has signing authority on corporate accounts only because you haven't revoked it, but that authority exists entirely at your discretion and can be terminated immediately." Catherine made a sound like something dying, a wounded animal noise that came from deep in her chest, but Elena couldn't look at her without feeling a rage that frightened her in its intensity. Margaret had started crying, quiet tears that mixed with rain as she realized that her own home, a gift from Thomas 10 years ago, was probably also controlled by the woman her sister had just publicly humiliated. Patricia and Veronica had moved toward their car, trying to leave, without being noticed, but 2 of the corporate security team had positioned themselves to block the driveway, their presence making it clear that nobody was going anywhere until this situation reached its conclusion. "I want Thomas here," Elena said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I want him to see this. I want him to understand what he's done." Victoria made a phone call, speaking in rapid sentences that Elena didn't try to follow, and within 15 minutes, another vehicle pulled into the driveway, Thomas's Mercedes, with Sophia visible in the passenger seat, both of them looking confused and irritated at being summoned from whatever celebration they'd been planning. Thomas emerged from the driver's side with his characteristic arrogance intact, his expression suggesting he believed he'd been called to deal with his hysterical ex-wife's breakdown. But that arrogance crumbled the moment he saw the corporate team, the police presence, and his mother's pale, terrified face. "What's going on?" Thomas demanded, but his voice lacked conviction, and Elena watched him look at the scattered belongings, at Victoria Chen's corporate credentials, at the documents being held by various attorneys, his mind clearly trying to piece together a puzzle whose solution he couldn't quite reach. "Mr. Bradford," Victoria said, her voice formal and cold, "I'm Victoria Chen, senior partner representing Morrison International Holdings. I'm here to inform you that your signing authority on all Bradford Industrial Group accounts has been terminated effective immediately, that your employment with the company has been suspended pending investigation into multiple contractual violations and financial improprieties, and that you have 72 hours to vacate this residence before foreclosure proceedings begin." Thomas stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound, and Elena felt a bitter satisfaction watching him struggle to comprehend words that should have been simple enough for a man who claimed to be a business genius. Sophia had gotten out of the car now, her expression calculating as she assessed the situation, with the mercenary instinct that had probably attracted Thomas to her in the first place, and Elena could see the exact moment when Sophia realized that Thomas Bradford was no longer a prize worth claiming. "There must be some mistake," Thomas finally managed, and Elena almost laughed at how similar his words were to his mother's, as if the entire Bradford family had been programmed with the same defensive response to reality they didn't like. "Morrison International is just the corporate entity that bought us out. I don't understand what this has to do with your wife?" Victoria interrupted, and she gestured toward Elena with one hand. Elena Christine Morrison Bradford, founder and CEO of Morrison International Holdings. The woman you just served divorce papers at her father's funeral is the person who's owned your company, and by extension your entire life, for the past 6 months. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain and Catherine's sharp intake of breath, and Elena watched understanding finally dawn on Thomas's face, watched him look at her as if seeing her for the first time, his eyes moving from her face to her pregnant belly to the scattered belongings that his mother had thrown into the street. She waited for remorse, for horror at what he'd done, but what she saw instead was anger, pure entitled rage that she'd deceived him, that she'd hidden her wealth, that she'd let him make decisions without knowing she controlled every outcome. "You lied to me," Thomas said, his voice shaking with fury rather than shame. "You let me think you were nobody. You let me love me for who I was rather than what I had," Elena finished, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Yes, Thomas, that was exactly the point, and you failed that test so completely that you're currently standing in the driveway of a house you no longer own, with a mistress who's already looking for an exit, having just destroyed your entire future for a woman who was only interested in your money, money that was actually mine all along." Sophia had indeed started backing toward the car, her calculation apparently complete, but Thomas grabbed her arm with desperate fingers, holding onto her as if she were a life raft in waters that had suddenly become far deeper and more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Victoria was speaking again, outlining the legal consequences of the property destruction, the corporate investigation that would examine every decision Thomas had made over the past 3 years, the criminal charges that Catherine might face for breaking and entering and destruction of property. But Elena barely heard. Her attention focused entirely on the man she'd married, the man whose child she carried, the man who'd served her divorce papers at her father's funeral. "I saved you," Elena said quietly, but her words carried clearly despite the rain. "Your company was bankrupt. Your family was about to lose everything. I saved you because I loved you, and you repaid me by cheating on me, by humiliating me, by serving me divorce papers at my father's funeral, while your mistress waited in the parking lot like some kind of victory prize." Thomas's face had gone white, and Elena saw him finally understand the magnitude of what he'd lost, saw the calculation happening behind his eyes as he tried to figure out how to salvage this, how to apologize or grovel or somehow convince her that he could change. But Elena had seen this expression before, the same calculating look he'd worn when Bradford Industrial Group was failing and he was trying to find someone else to blame for his mistakes. And she knew with absolute certainty that any apology he offered would be about preserving his wealth and status rather than genuine remorse for how he'd treated her. "You have 72 hours, Elena repeated Victoria's earlier words. "After that, everything you think you own becomes legally mine to dispose of as I see fit." She turned away from him then, from all of them, her hand still protectively on her belly, as she walked past the scattered remains of her belongings toward one of the waiting SUVs, leaving the Bradfords standing in the rain with the ruins of their former lives spread across the driveway like evidence at a crime scene. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Elena Morrison sat in a small diner on the outskirts of Portland, her belly now enormous at 9 months pregnant, stirring a cup of herbal tea she hadn't actually wanted but had ordered because the owner, a kind-faced man in his late 30s named Daniel Rivers, had recommended it with such genuine concern for her health that she couldn't refuse. She'd been coming to this diner every morning for 6 weeks now, ever since she'd left New York and the wreckage of her former life behind, seeking anonymity in a city where nobody knew her name or her net worth or the scandal that had dominated business news for months after the Bradford family's spectacular downfall. Daniel approached her table with a plate of scrambled eggs and whole wheat toast, setting it down with gentle hands that bore the calluses of someone who'd worked hard his entire life. his smile warm but not intrusive as he refilled her water glass without being asked. He didn't know she was a billionaire. She'd introduced herself simply as Elena, a woman who'd left a bad situation and was starting over, and he'd accepted that explanation without prying or pushing for details that she clearly wasn't ready to share. What he did know was that she was alone and pregnant, and seemed to carry a sadness that made him want to help in whatever small ways he could. "You're not eating enough," Daniel said, and Elena heard genuine worry in his voice, rather than judgment. "The baby needs you to keep your strength up." Elena looked at the eggs, her stomach churning with the nausea that had plagued her entire third trimester. But she picked up her fork because Daniel's concern felt real in a way that nothing had felt real for months, not since her father's funeral and the revelation that had destroyed the Bradfords and left her feeling more alone than she'd ever been, despite her billions. She took a bite, tasted nothing, swallowed anyway, and was rewarded with Daniel's approving nod before he moved away to help another customer, giving her space while still keeping her in his peripheral vision, as if he were standing guard over her well-being without making a show of it. What Elena didn't know yet, what she would only learn months later when Daniel finally shared his own story, was that the kind man who owned this diner had once been a successful engineer at Mitchell Technologies, a rising star with a wife named Jennifer, and 4 children he'd loved with absolute devotion, until the day his boss, Richard Mitchell, decided he wanted Jennifer for himself. Daniel had been laid off on fabricated performance issues, had come home to discover his joint bank account emptied of the $83,000 they'd saved over 12 years, had received divorce papers the same day Jennifer moved into Richard's mansion across town, taking the 4 children, ages 3 to 11, with her and denying Daniel any visitation rights while the legal process played out. The DNA tests that Richard had secretly ordered while still employing Daniel had revealed what Jennifer had hidden for over a decade. None of the 4 children were biologically Daniel's. All of them had been fathered by Richard during an affair that had apparently begun before Daniel and Jennifer's wedding day, making Daniel's entire marriage a lie built on deception so profound that it had nearly destroyed him completely. He'd lost his job, his savings, his wife, and the children he'd believed were his in the span of 3 weeks, and the diner he now owned had been purchased with money borrowed from his elderly mother, a last desperate attempt to rebuild something meaningful from the ruins of his former existence. But despite everything he'd lost, despite betrayals that would have made most people bitter and closed off, Daniel had somehow maintained a kindness that drew people to him, regular customers who came, not just for the food, but for his genuine interest in their lives, his ability to remember names and preferences and small details that made them feel seen. Elena had been wary of that kindness at first, suspicious of anyone who seemed too good to be true, after Thomas had proven that her judgment was catastrophically flawed. But 6 weeks of daily interactions had shown her that Daniel's compassion wasn't a performance or a manipulation, but simply who he was at his core. The diner door opened with a jingle of bells, and Elena looked up to see a young woman struggling with a stroller and 2 bags of groceries, and before she could even process what was happening, Daniel had crossed the room to help, holding the door and carrying the groceries to a table while making the woman laugh with some self-deprecating joke about his inability to fold strollers correctly. Elena watched this small act of service, this moment of kindness offered without expectation of reward or recognition, and felt something shift in her chest. Not romantic attraction, not yet, but a recognition that perhaps not all men were like Thomas Bradford, that perhaps her father had been right when he'd said, the measure of a person wasn't what they did when life was easy, but how they treated others when they themselves had nothing left to give. Her water broke 20 minutes later, a sudden gush that soaked through her dress and onto the vinyl booth seat, And Elena's first coherent thought through the panic was embarrassment that she'd ruined Daniel's furniture. But Daniel was already there, his phone out calling 911, his other hand gently gripping hers while he spoke in that calm, steady voice that had made her feel safe for weeks, telling her that everything would be okay, that the ambulance was coming, that he'd stay with her as long as she needed him there. "I don't have anyone," Elena heard herself saying, the truth she'd been avoiding for months finally breaking through. "My father's gone, my husband, my ex-husband, he's not. I don't have anyone to call." "You have me," Daniel said simply, and Elena saw in his eyes that he meant it, that this virtual stranger was offering to stand beside her through one of life's most vulnerable moments without knowing anything about her except that she was alone and frightened and needed help. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but Daniel kept his word, riding with her to the hospital and staying through 14 hours of labor, holding her hand and bringing her ice chips, and never once making her feel like a burden or an obligation. He was there when her daughter was born, 7 pounds, 3 ounces, with Elena's dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival with impressive volume, and he was the first person Elena allowed to hold the baby after the nurses had cleaned her and wrapped her in the pink blanket that the hospital provided. "She's beautiful," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at the infant in his arms, and Elena saw tears on his cheeks, tears for the children he'd lost, probably, for the family he'd believed he had, but also tears of genuine joy for this new life that had just entered the world. "What are you going to name her?" "Grace," Elena said, the name coming to her with sudden certainty. Grace Christine Morrison. Over the following months, as Elena recovered from childbirth and learned to navigate motherhood, Daniel became a constant presence in her life. Not as a romantic interest, but as a friend who seemed to understand instinctively when she needed help and when she needed space, who brought meals to her small apartment and never commented on the fact that she could clearly afford better, who played with baby Grace with the practiced ease of someone who'd once been a father and missed it desperately. Elena watched him carefully during those months, testing his character in ways he didn't realize, leaving her wallet visible to see if money went missing. It never did. Mentioning opportunities that would benefit him to see if he'd try to exploit their friendship. He never did. Observing how he treated service workers and strangers and people who had nothing to offer him in return. What she discovered was that Daniel Rivers was exactly who he appeared to be, a man who'd been shattered by betrayal but had chosen kindness over bitterness, generosity over self-protection, hope over cynicism. He worked 16-hour days at his diner to pay back his mother's loan, sent money to children who weren't biologically his but whom he still loved despite having no legal rights to see them, and treated everyone he encountered with dignity and respect, regardless of their social status or ability to reciprocate. On Grace's first birthday, Elena invited Daniel to a small celebration in her apartment, and after the cake was eaten and the presents were opened, and Grace was sleeping peacefully in her crib, Elena finally told him the truth about who she was. She showed him the corporate documents that proved she owned Morrison International Holdings, the bank statements that demonstrated her net worth, the news articles about the Bradford scandal that she'd been hiding from him for over a year, and she watched his face carefully, waiting for his expression to change, for greed or calculation or resentment to appear in his eyes. But Daniel just looked at her with that same gentle kindness he'd always shown her, and when he finally spoke, his words were not about money or opportunity or what her wealth could do for him, but rather a simple question. "Does this mean you've been afraid I'd treat you differently if I knew?" "Yes," Elena admitted, and she felt tears start to fall, because his reaction was everything she'd hoped for and feared she'd never find. "Every relationship I've ever had has been poisoned by money. My ex-husband only wanted me when he thought I was poor and controllable, and then he hated me when he discovered I had power. I needed to know that you saw me, just me, just Elena, before you knew about Morrison International. Daniel reached across the small table between them and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and steady against her palm, and Elena felt something she hadn't felt since before her father's death. Genuine safety, not the kind that money could buy or security teams could provide, but the safety of being truly known and accepted by someone who had no ulterior motives. He didn't propose that night, didn't rush into declarations of love, but he told her that he'd like to keep being her friend, that his feelings for her, feelings that had been growing for months but that he'd kept carefully hidden because she'd seemed fragile, and he didn't want to take advantage of her vulnerability, weren't about Morrison International or billion-dollar corporations, but about the woman who loved her daughter fiercely and tipped generously and always asked about his day with genuine interest. They were married 2 years later in a small ceremony at the diner where they'd met, with Grace as flower girl and Daniel's mother as matron of honor, and Elena wore a simple dress that cost $300 rather than the designer gown she could have afforded, because Daniel had fallen in love with a woman in a diner booth, not a billionaire in a boardroom. She transferred ownership of the diner to Daniel as a wedding gift, along with enough capital to open 5 more locations, but she did it through a trust that would provide him income and opportunity, without making him feel like he'd married her for money, giving him the dignity of building something himself, while removing the crushing debt that had been weighing him down for years. Morrison International Holdings thrived under Elena's leadership, growing from $17 billion to $32 billion over 5 years, but Elena made sure that her home life remained separate from her corporate identity, that Grace and Daniel and the 3 more children they'd have together knew her primarily as mom rather than CEO. Daniel never forgot what it felt like to lose everything, and that memory made him cherish every moment with Elena and their family, treating her with respect and partnership and genuine love that had nothing to do with her bank account and everything to do with who she was when she woke up at 3 a.m. to feed a crying baby or burned dinner because she'd been distracted by a work call or laughed until she cried at his terrible jokes. As for Thomas Bradford, he'd managed to find employment at a mid-level management position after the scandal died down, his ego diminished but not destroyed, still believing somehow that he'd been the victim rather than the architect of his own downfall. Catherine Bradford had lost her penthouse and most of her social standing, forced to move into a modest apartment in Queens and face the reality that her son's poor judgment had cost their family everything their ancestors had built. Sophia had married a hedge fund manager within 6 months of leaving Thomas, her mercenary instincts proving accurate as always. But Elena rarely thought about the Bradfords anymore, their betrayal fading into something that felt distant and almost unreal, like a nightmare she'd woken from to discover a life far better than anything she could have imagined. She had Daniel, whose kindness had healed wounds she'd thought were permanent, and Grace and their 3 sons, James, Robert, and Michael, and a marriage built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than deception and control. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised her with a photograph he'd secretly commissioned, a recreation of that first morning in the diner, Elena sitting in the same booth where she'd been sitting when her water broke, but this time surrounded by their 4 children and looking not alone and frightened, but content and loved. He'd written on the back, "To the woman who taught me that second chances are real, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments. You saved me just as much as I saved you." Elena hung that photograph in their home office, where she could see it every day as she managed billions of dollars and thousands of employees, a reminder that wealth without love was poverty, and that the greatest fortune she'd ever acquired was the family she'd built with a kind man who'd helped her when she had nothing to offer him except a chance to do the right thing. Their children grew up knowing both abundance and humility, taught by Daniel's example that money was a tool, rather than a measure of worth, and by Elena's story, that character revealed itself most clearly in how people treated those who couldn't benefit them. Grace Morrison Rivers eventually took over Morrison International Holdings, but her brothers chose different paths. James became a teacher, Robert a social worker, Michael a chef who opened a chain of diners in honor of his father's first restaurant, all of them carrying forward the values that Elena and Daniel had modeled every day of their lives. And on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the house was still, Elena would sometimes find Daniel in the kitchen, cooking with the same careful attention he'd once used to make her breakfast in that small diner, and she would wrap her arms around him from behind and thank whatever force of chance or fate or divine intervention had led her to that particular restaurant on that particular morning, pregnant and alone and broken, but somehow exactly where she needed to be to find the one person who would love her, not despite her scars, but because of everything she'd survived to become who she was. The Bradfords had taught her what love wasn't: manipulation, control, conditional acceptance based on maintaining an acceptable image. But Daniel Rivers had shown her what love was: choosing someone every day, seeing their flaws and loving them anyway, building something together that was stronger than either person could create alone, standing beside someone not because of what they could provide, but because their presence made the world feel more complete. And that, Elena thought, as she watched her husband teach their youngest son how to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, was worth more than all the billions Morrison International would ever generate, more valuable than every property she owned or company she'd acquired or victory she'd won in the corporate world. She'd set out to write a story about betrayal and revenge, but she'd ended up writing one about redemption and second chances and the surprising places where people find their way home.